Oi oi, it's your boy, the Bo Nickal of Tickle My Pickle, Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast, and we're coming at you following UFC Sandhagen versus Figueiredo and RIZIN. Whatever number of that we're on. Loads of stuff happened this weekend, almost all of it bad. The boxing was a travesty. They set up a ring in Times Square. Awesome. The whole thing was sort of sponsored by Fatal Fury, so you're going, okay, maybe like a fighting game stage sort of set up here, and then they put up walls all around it so that people couldn't see, and then the crowd was like 50 jerks who've been invited, so weird choices all round there, but they had 3 fights on and all of them were garbage. Then Canelo fought the next night, and that fight was garbage, and then they announced they're going to be doing Canelo versus Crawford, which should be big, but it's going to be the first event in TKO boxing. So that's going to be very interesting because Crawford and Canelo are not going to be taking a pay cut. The event will do a similar number of tickets and buys to a major UFC card. So the stars on the UFC cards are going to have to look on while Canelo and Crawford earn at least 10 times as much as them for the same work. It's going to be very interesting, this sort of like crashing together of worlds, where the UFC tries to present boxing and MMA as the same thing, or at least similar things, while boxers are paid considerably more. Now, the argument that the UFC will try and make is that boxers are paid too much, which, after the fights this weekend, I'm sure some people will jump on board with, but that's a hard pitch to fellow fighters in the UFC. You've got to really do a number on them psychologically to make them mad at the boxers for earning more money. And also, who is going to come to TKO if they're already making big boxing money? Are they going to drop it to come to TKO? So the whole thing is very intriguing. They want to get the Ali Act changed, so the speculation is that they want to run another sport into the ground. But we'll see. It was very funny watching Ryan Garcia lose to Rolly Romero, though, because Rolly Romero, if you've seen him fight before, bit of a laughing stock. But he actually, I mean, the fight wasn't much, but he hurt Ryan Garcia in the second round, and Ryan Garcia was like, oh, I don't like this. And then it turns out if you fight with your right hand nailed to the side of your head, Ryan Garcia's left hook can't hit you. And then he doesn't have anything else. Dude literally looked like he gave up. And then there was Karate Combat on as well, which is always just hilarious silliness. Sam Alvey versus Tyrone Spong. Tyrone Spong, one of the great falls from grace in combat sports history. Unbelievably good kickboxer. Unbelievably good. Broke his shin in half on a check against Gokhan Saki in Glory, retired from kickboxing, focused on his boxing. His boxing was always great within kickboxing, comes up through the boxing ranks, wins the Latin American heavyweight title or whatever, becomes a ranked contender in a couple of sanctioning bodies' rankings. When Alexander Usyk comes up from cruiserweight, he's matched against Tyrone Spong. It's going to be a pretty big fight. People are going to have their eyes on it. Then Tyrone Spong pops for roids and never gets to fight again until he comes back 5 years later. Usyk went on to win the title and be like the heavyweight defining this generation. Tyrone Spong comes back against Sam Alvey in Karate Combat and gets knocked out. It was crazy to watch. So big ups Sam Alvey for pulling that off. I think really more Spong is just unbelievably washed. But the funniest takes coming out of this are like, oh, well, he could come back into the light heavyweight division and be top 10 now because the division's got worse and he's got better. It's like, no, I think Karate Combat's just awful. They had Muhammad Makayev came in against some guy who was, again, just an MMA fighter, randomer. They had him in gi pants, and Makayev actually put together some cool kicks. He did a front leg roundhouse kick into rear leg teep for the finishing combination, but he'd been hitting with, front snap kick, whatever. He'd been hitting him with kicks all the way through, showing off the striking that he never showed off in the UFC, except for like the first round of the Charles Johnson fight. But it was classic Karate Combat. This is what they're doing with Rebellis Despan. People are like, well, Rebellis Despan had a rough run in the UFC, but he's starched 4 guys in under 30 seconds since then. And you're like, have you looked at the guys? Have you seen what they've done? The last guy Rebellis Despan knocked out, that was his 8th first-round knockout loss in like 6 years as a fighter. Very easy to make someone look good. If you find one moderately talented guy and then start hanging out in bus stations looking for opponents. So let's jump over to the UFC. Corey Sandhagen versus Davison Figueiredo. It was an intriguing matchup. I talked about it briefly on the Boycast. Maybe not as much as I should have, because I think I summed it up best when I said these guys are going to wrestle and people are going to be mad about it because they haven't been paying attention. Both these guys love their wrestling now. But I talked about Sandhagen and his ability to turn his back, because he got so much flack for how quickly Aljamain Sterling jumped on his back and choked him. It was 1:30, I think. And now he gives up his back routinely and guys can't do anything with it. Umar Nurmagomedov considers himself like a rear naked choke specialist. Every time Sandhagen got in the slightest bit of trouble on the mat, he'd give up his back, and either Umar would take the back body lock and Sandhagen would peel his hands apart and turn back into him, or Umar would jump on his back and Corey Sandhagen would whip the hand over his head and turn back into him on the mat, or let him fall over the top. And he did two of those things against Devison Figueiredo here. Figueiredo got top position. Corey Sandhagen just literally turned his back from guard. He went, okay, getting up now. Figueiredo tried to jump over the top onto Corey's back, and he just fell on the floor. And I think he spent the rest of the round on the mat getting punched in the face because of it. As we always say, going for the back or having gotten the back seems to be the position in MMA at the moment where most people, or most fights end up being reversed. And then in the second round, Figueiredo shot to his back, I think, or ducked under a punch and jumped and went to the back body lock, and Corey just peeled his hands apart and turned back into him. I'm struggling to think of anyone in MMA who is as good at separating the hands like that. If the guy's got the back body lock, he just peels them apart and turns back into them. Which is real basic stuff, but I've just never seen anyone do it so well, so routinely, against such good opponents. He did it to Umar Nurmagomedov like half a dozen times. Time for a sip of tea. This podcast is being brought to you by Marks & Spencer's Earl Grey. It's what we had in. Actually, no, this podcast is brought to you by the Willie Pep Advanced Striking 2.0 and Willie Pep Film Room that I dropped on the YouTube earlier this week. If you want to see cool footwork in fights from the 40s, that's your one. Corey hit some nice takedowns of his own, head outside, or doubles actually, not singles. He was doing sort of GSP double with the chest pressure. But this fight was decided by TKO knee injury. Actually, successful heel hook, no tap. Came on top. Guy screamed. Verbal submission, maybe. Technical submission back in the day, if you let an arm or leg break and the referee has to step in. That was a big drama early on in Pride Championship. Kazushi Sakuraba drove Royler Gracie's arm up his back so far that the referee went, oh, come on, let's stop that. And then he did the same thing having broken Renzo Gracie's arm. And the Gracies, this was 25 years ago, yesterday actually, but the Gracies were so mad about it that Royce Gracie asked for his own special rules against Sakuraba for the Pride 2000 Grand Prix, and Sakuraba said, yeah, cool, let's do that. They had a 90-minute fight, 15-minute rounds, and Royce Gracie had to quit in the end. He was like, oh, I'm getting my ass kicked under the rules that I specially requested. And then Sakuraba went on and fought the number one ranked heavyweight in the world at that time in the next round on the same night. Unbelievable. But anyway, yeah, technical submission was a big crux of that beef. All the Gracies would say, well, we never tapped. And it's like, bro, you got your arm broke off. But I've seen guys play it off. Corey Sandhagen in the same position against TJ Dillashaw. I believe he did pop his knee, did ACL him with the heel hook, and because TJ didn't fall on his back and scream, he tried to stay on top and he just sort of continued the fight. TJ ended up winning a decision that he didn't deserve and getting a title shot that he didn't deserve and popping his shoulder out in camp and then still going into the fight. So Aljamain Sterling got a title defense that he didn't deserve. But that's the weird way that this sport works. The intrigue of this fight was both guys were looking for leg entanglements. I'm always talking about leg entanglements because if you do them badly, you get knocked out. And then the commentators go, that's why you never go for leg locks in MMA. Oh, it's a terrible idea, blah, blah, blah. When really, if you watch guys who do leg attacks well in MMA, like Charles Oliveira, they're using leg attacks to turn the guy away so that the guy can't hit them and they get a chance to scramble up. And in the course of that, go watch Charles Oliveira against Kevin Lee. That's the perfect example. Keeps using leg entanglements to stop Kevin Lee from throwing down ground and pound. Kevin Lee's knees are fucked for life now because of the rolls he went through with Charles Oliveira trying to break his legs. Didn't tap, but did get messed up knees for life. Figgy was looking over and over again for the Pantoja style entry from the bottom, where Pantoja goes from half guard, he scoops under the leg, throws his own leg over the opponent's center line and reaps the leg inward, which is sort of a scramble creator for the most part, in MMA at least. Pantoja uses it all the time to get up from under people. Did it in the 5th round when he was gassed out against Royval. Did it against Askar Askarov. I think I did a Filthy Casuals guide on this. Just look up Filthy Casuals guide Pantoja on YouTube. It'll have 500 views probably, because Pantoja is just box office poison, even though he's fantastic. But what Sandhagen did when he went for a leg entanglement was he passed it across his body. So instead of having Figgy's left leg on the right side of his body, he had Figgy's left leg on the left side of his body. So they both had their left knee going into the opponent's left knee in the 50-50, as it's called, because the position is identical for both men. Or at least that's the reason it's named that way. Corey Sandhagen has been working for a long time with Ryan Hall, the OG 50-50 guy. There was a point when Ryan Hall was competing every weekend in the US, turning up at random NAGA events and stuff, and he was doing great work with the 50-50. But even in MMA, he had fantastic success with the 50-50 on The Ultimate Fighter. He submitted 2 guys with it, I believe. In all of his MMA fights in the UFC, he ended up in the 50-50 at some point. And against BJ Penn, of course, he rolls into the 50-50 to get an inside heel hook and get the finish very quickly. The 50-50 is a really interesting position because on appearances, you have the same controls as the opponent, so it seems like it should be a literal 50-50, a shootout. He can get you and you can get him. But like any position, it's your technical knowledge you can use to turn to one hip, turn to the other, control their hands, fight their other foot, use your other foot to hide your trapped foot, and all sorts of things to make it a skill position and not like a random shootout position. But people do still steer clear of it now. Like, I was watching Gordon Ryan teaching leg locks the other day, and he talks about the 50-50, and he says it doesn't really fit into our brackets, the Danaher Death Squad, or sorry, New Wave Jiu-Jitsu, and they've just changed their name again to Kingsway. But the Danaher Squad, who made leg locks a big deal in modern grappling, they apparently don't have much time for the 50-50 because because they see it as a position where you are giving the opponent an advantage when you really want like an asymmetrical position where you're attacking their leg and they're not attacking yours. But both Sandhagen and Thun Lee train under Ryan Hall. Who else? There's another guy who just the other day he picked up a finish by submission and it was really good odds in the UFC. Can't remember his name. Wasn't he like Ecuadorian or something? But yeah, there's a few guys now who train under Ryan Hall and do this. Thun Lee did it against Ilya Freemanov in one championship, which is a great fight and also a great little story because Freemanov is Rafael Fiziev's boy. He's like his protege. And he started his pro career in 2015, but turned up at the Amateur Worlds to win it in 2019. with a dozen pro fights, he was like, yes, I'm a complete amateur. But Thun Lee ends up getting taken down, turns his back as he's getting up, rolls through his legs to grab Freemanov's leg, and then he deliberately, instead of being in like a regular attacking position on the leg, he passes it across his body to put Freemanov into the 50-50. And Freemanov's standing over him. Now, the great thing about when the opponent is standing over you in the 50-50, as you'll see in the Corey Sandhagen, Davison Figueiredo fight, you get a good chance to off-balance them, but if they ever come close enough, when they're like swinging at your head or whatever, you can go underneath them. You can put your head through their legs and come out behind them, and their knee collapses into the space where you were. So Charles Oliveira did this to Kevin Lee as well. When you roll through the opponent's legs, their knee comes down to the mat, you're behind them looking at their butt. They're having to look over their shoulder at you, and you can heel hook them while you're basically behind them. So all that stuff about getting hit while attempting leg locks stops applying for the moment. And they got a hard job to try and get back to a defensive position, but you've got a back step to begin defending, so you've got a whole movement you have to do before you can start saving your ACL. It's a very legitimate move, and if you want to look up someone doing that at the highest levels of grappling against guys who outweigh him by 50, 60, 70 pounds, Lachlan Giles, Lachlangiles, in one of the ADCCs, he went through the absolute division against the guy who won the heavyweight division and a couple of other just massive lads, and he hit him with the backside 50-50. He just convinced them to come into his guard, went into the backside 50-50 and tore their ACLs to shreds. which is a very cool way to earn the nickname the Giant Killer. And it was a pretty cool way for him to round off his weekend, because he went out in the first round of his own division. He entered the Absolute on like let's give it a go. So 50-50, still a very intriguing position to see people work from. I would say whenever you see someone enter the legs from the bottom, and then they push the opponent back so that they lighten the leg, and then they pass that leg across their body into what looks like a step backwards, because it looks like you're putting the opponent into an even position with you. Whenever you see that, think that that guy probably knows something that his opponent doesn't. So we got really into the nitty-gritty there, but and I think Bisping tried to say, like, oh, unfortunate knee injury, and Corey Sandhagen said, well, if you don't know the 50-50, you get your knee popped. Oh, and shout out to Ryan Hall, because he did the original 50-50 tapes on, I think that's World Martial Arts, one of the first really good instructional sets back in the day. And then 10, 15 years later, he now has his own website where he's done a modern 50-50, and it really is exceptional. If you are a grappler and you want to learn about the 50-50, it's Ryan Hall and Lachlan Giles are your best bets. They are the masters. And the really interesting thing is that I think the 50-50 in the gi caught on first, because you can't really hurt. I mean, the 50-50 in the gi, you can't heel hook. So that's the main attack gone. Gilbert Burns, most people won't even believe this, but Gilbert Burns used to be a gi guy who did the 50-50, and he'd stall in the 50-50 for the whole match, and then come up on top of the 50-50 and get an advantage and win by one advantage. And honestly, you would not even believe how boring he was as a grappler. And then he came to MMA, and it's like he's now giving back to the world by knocking people out and being exciting. So the other one that everyone's talking about is Reinier Derrida versus Bo Nickal. Reinier Derrida, boy of the podcast, listener of the podcast, occasional commenter of the podcast, and very much into the Musashi memes. But I thought this was really interesting, because coming into this fight, Bo Nickal obviously massive wrestling advantage in theory. On the Boycast, I was talking about this, and I talk about this whenever a pure wrestling talent comes into MMA. Cage wrestling is such a different game that the sport of MMA might as well be called cage wrestling, because that's the thing that everyone is doing every day. They're all in the gym training their get-ups and takedowns along the fence. That doesn't exist in freestyle, folk style, any other style, sumo, bok, any style around the world. They do not use a fence to wrestle against. And some very skilled freestyle and folk style wrestlers have come up against guys who don't have any kind of wrestling background and struggled when they used the cage well. And then there was the ground game stuff, because obviously Bo Nickal is not that slick on the ground. He's got the top control and athletic advantages of being a really high-level wrestler, but he's not particularly slick with it. But then Bo Nickal's got the overhand and the big explosive power. Derrida is not particularly explosive on the feet, and he's been quite hittable in some of his fights. And his takedowns are decent, but they're not amazing. He did, like, when he had the grappling match with Andre Galvao, I remember thinking, yeah, Andre Galvao is going to have some trouble, because Reinier Derrida wrestles every day really well, and Andre Galvao is a top player. If he has to just, like, pull guard against Derrida, he's going to have trouble. That was always Galvao's problem in MMA. He came into MMA as one of the greats of grappling, but he's a top player in grappling, and he unfortunately ran up against the young Tyron Woodley in his MMA career. He couldn't even get a hold of a leg. Got smoked, went back to grappling. But we talked about Derrida doing this interesting stuff that he's been doing since the Malakin fights to sort of make up for being a really tall guy who doesn't shoot takedowns very well. He throws a nice long jab, sometimes a very stiff jab. In this fight, he's like lunging through his jabs, and he leaves it out there. Or as the opponent comes in, he throws his jab over their shoulder, which acts in the same way as a shoulder roll. If you've got your shoulder up nice and high and you put your arm over the opponent's shoulder, it's the same as a shoulder roll, except that your ribs are open, which most people don't care about anyway. And he'll either grab the collar tie, which is the hand behind the head and elbow in front of the collarbone, or he'll grab the overhook, or the whizzer, which is where the opponent has the underhook and you wrap over their arm. And a notable example of this would be Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic 1. Cormier came out with the intention of like grabbing anything he could, an overhook, a collar tie, whatever. And Stipe ends up pulling back away from the clinch with his head forward of his hips, and Cormier hits him with either an uppercut or a hook on the chin as he's got the collar tie and knocks him down. But it's an interesting unexplored area in dirty boxing, using the leverage guard and the jab to grab ties. Derrida did it here, and he beat the piss out of Bo Nickal. What he did really well was playing on that overhook And then with the overhook, you're giving the opponent the underhook, which can be bad. Bo Nickal's very good on the underhook. If you watched him in some of his earlier fights in the UFC, when he gets the underhook, he pushes people to the fence and he hits the knee tap off the fence. But Derrida did a great job of posting his head against Bo Nickal's temple and controlling the other hand. And that's the position that Leon Edwards beats people up from, hits them with knees to the body over and over again. And that's what Derrida did here. He just got his hips back, had his head posted in front of Bo Nickal's, fought the other hand, so he's sometimes holding it, sometimes just pushing it away, and he slammed in knees to the body, and uppercuts to the body, uppercuts to the head. He was really annoying Nickal with those. And then he'd also use his whizzer arm to reach all the way through and grab the wrist on the other side, so he'd take both hands out of the way with one hand and free one hand of his to punch. It was really beautiful stuff. Watch that fight back again, because it's great fun, but the really special part is how Derrida is able to give up the underhook, so that he's got the overhook, but give up the underhook to a very strong wrestler, but never let him lock his hands, because Derrida is always controlling the other hand. Locked hands is a really big deal. I'm going to do a Filthy Casuals guide to how Bilal killed the king later this week, and we're going to be talking about how shooting and locking his hands along the fence against Edwards was like the big difference, being able to do that. But also the space that Derrida makes between his body and Bo Nickal's. Because if Bo has the underhook and Derrida has the overhook, and they just press chest to chest, hip to hip, that's a wrestling position. Derrida was able to get his hips away from Nickal, and a lot of the time that means posting the head under their chin, under their temple, wherever you can, to get your upper body on a little bit of an angle so that your hips are behind your head. And then you can hit the knees. And he was digging little knees that really, they're very underrated in MMA. If you watch Demetrius Johnson's career, he gets guys wincing with just little knees. He doesn't power them in. He's not grabbing hold of the fence and giving the guy some welly. He's just using the kneecap into the squishy parts of the body at the right time. With most things in MMA, it's an accuracy thing more than it is a power thing. And timing, of course, timing too. If you catch someone breathing in, you can't always, most of the time you can't affect this. This will just be like how it happens. If you catch someone breathing in with a body shot, it really does take it out of them. But you can also listen to people breathing in the clinch and try and time it. I know guys who grapple on the ground and try and time putting their weight through the opponent's midsection when they hear them breathing in. But I thought this was a beautiful performance by Derrida, and I really liked, it was really interesting to see him play the overhook, but not in the way that I expect people who are good at the overhook to play the overhook. If you want to play the overhook, you've probably got to have some great whizzer throws, the big judo throws, which I've been saying for a while are like a big difference maker in MMA now, because that's a position you end up in along the fence. And if you have a good whizzer throw in your arsenal, you can get off the fence by attacking it aggressively. You know, you don't have to throw the guy, you just have to get him off balance so that you can run away. That's worked against like all the best cage wrestlers. It's been sort of the one reliable way out. But Derrida went for a couple of overhook throws in this fight, and he like threw himself onto the floor and gave up his back doing it by accident. And he went, oh dear. You know, you did get to see that Bo Nickel really is like an iron horse to take down. But Derrida was mostly using that overhook to set up striking, and it was basically a sort of extended Muay Thai clinch with 4-ounce gloves and the occasional threat of the takedown, which I really liked, because Derrida is so tall in that weight class and so long in that weight class. You know, he's not a particularly explosive guy, and he has a disadvantage on level changes. If he ever wants to shoot takedowns on people, he's got to get lower than his opponent would have to get in on their hips. So using this sort of dirty boxing with overhooks and collar ties, I really like that for him. And I'm also just happy for him because this sort of happened with Luke Rockhold back in the day. Came over from another company where he'd been the guy, lost a fight pretty emphatically. Everyone went, well, couldn't have been that good anyway. And then he continued to improve because he wasn't done growing as a fighter. And I think you're clearly seeing that Reinier Derrida is growing as a fighter. Now, Derrida did it in a different order, to be fair. He didn't lose in the UFC. He lost in one. He lost to Malakin a couple of times. But I think a lot of people were sort of, well, even me, I was sort of like, have we reached the limit of what Derrida can do? I know, he did what good fighters do. He found ways to make up for his shortcomings. The Malakin fights are mad, though, because the size of Malakin. Derrida was so starved for competition in one that he went from, I believe, middleweight up to light heavyweight and then heavyweight. And then Malakin beat him at heavyweight and then fought him at middleweight for the middleweight title. And you're going, hang on, didn't you guys solve weight cutting? Doesn't it not exist over there anymore? Um, it's just insane watching them claim stuff like that. And then you got people like, they've got more double champions than I've ever seen anywhere. And you're going, how? How do they fight at that weight and then cut down to this weight? Especially if you're doing the bigger weight first. It's just crazy. The only other interesting fight for me on this card was Mason Jones versus Jeremy Stephens, funnily enough. Jeremy Stephens back for a one-night only deal, being an Iowa person. And Mason Jones back from sort of a self-imposed exile to Cage Warriors. I thought he was cut. Apparently, he felt unimpressed by his UFC run, and he went back to Cage Warriors to work on himself. And you know what? I thought he looked really good here. You know, he did get hit a fair amount, but he was looking so hittable in his first UFC run, having run through Cage Warriors. He won the welterweight title in Cage Warriors and came down to lightweight. But he was fighting like Mike Davis, and he'd throw a couple of punches and then just get like Mike Davis would crack him back. And it's like you can't just stand there and take them. You've got to throw your punches and then move. And in this fight, he was actually doing a great job of like jabbing and then moving his head. The jab to left hook to the body that he was doing over and over again, beautiful. He did some nice jab pulls. He did some nice jab dips. I preferred the jab dips because Stephens always answered with the overhand. If you saw when Jones got hurt in the second round, it was like he did a jab and a lazy pull and got hit with an overhand. And then he did exactly the same thing again. He was like, oh, I'll just do it better this time. And he got caught again. And then he went back to his corner between rounds, and his corner had given him advice, and he said, he's faster than me. And the corner were like, no, he's not faster than you, because they were saying, don't dirty box. You know, don't do it on the inside. Use your jab and stuff again, because it was working so well in the first round. And he seemed to think that Stephens was faster than him, so he was not going to have success on the outside. But I liked his kicking game. He was kicking the body with front kicks. He landed some nice wheel kicks in between, calf kicks and stuff. He generally made Jeremy Stephens look very bad. You know, Jeremy Stephens has been basically just doing bare knuckle for the last couple of years. And for the most part, Mason Jones boxed him up. Did get hurt and take him down, and then he dominated the third round, basically holding a Kimura that he couldn't break free because Jeremy Stephens is very strong and has had some time off in BKFC away from USADA, and now, of course, USADA isn't in the UFC anymore. As people keep speculating about Daniel Rodriguez's sudden return to physique. But they did catch, who was it? Brazilian journeyman. Douglas da Silva de Andrade. They caught him the other day, which is the biggest star that they've caught since USADA. In fact, even USADA, they didn't catch anyone. So luckily, it turns out that almost no one is using drugs in the UFC anyway. But yeah, thought Jones looked good. Oh, side note, we were in Iowa, so that's why Jeremy Stephens was back. Jeremy Stephens gave a decent account of himself, to be fair. And you got to remember with this fight, like I watched it, I was really impressed by Mason Jones, and I thought, oh, wow, maybe he has really worked on himself. But you do have to remember, former welterweight come down to lightweight versus former featherweight up at lightweight. So, you know, it's yeah. But they were in Iowa, and Reinier won that fight and then said, so that's the best American wrestler. Now I'd like the best American striker, Sean Strickland. And everyone went, oh, Strickland isn't the best American striker, blah, blah. But I think he should have milked it more. This is the home of the Hawkeyes. He should have been like, that's the best American wrestler? That's the best American wrestler? Dan Gable, you old hack, where are you? Should have really laid into Iowa about their wrestling. About how American wrestling cannot stand up to Dutch clinch fighting. And it just doesn't build toughness the same way that grappling in spats and butt scooting does. Anything else on that card that wasn't trash? Gillian Robertson won. Again, 2 weeks before the Canada card, she's on this card. She's the most successful fighter currently out of Canada, except maybe Ayman Zahabi. And she's never on the Canada card. She always fights 2 weeks before, or 1 week before on some random fight night. It's such a strange thing. And then people say, well, the tax is greater in Canada. Maybe she doesn't. And I say, okay, good for you. Frugal, Gillian Robertson. Most women's MMA fighters save their money by having their coach and their husband be the same person. But it should be the UFC making up the difference. Like, if you want to go to different locales than Nevada, you need to make up for the fact that the fighters are going to be paying tax. Which I imagine they do with big stars, but it's like, if you can't offer her a few $1,000s more when she's the most successful Canadian, just wild. Dontel Mays versus Thomas Peterson. I mean, the heavyweight division is shambles, but I just watched RIZIN this morning, and they're doing a heavyweight tournament. And they don't have any fucking heavyweights. They got Mikio Ueda, who's kind of a scrub, but he did win the Kyokushin Worlds. So he's legit in Kyokushin. And people keep hoping he does something cool. He head kicked Sudario by accident, like falling over. But he fought a dude who came out in knee braces and was limping already. And then he low kicked him into a TKO. People are like, oh, low kick TKO. And I go, did you look at how the guy was moving before the kicks even landed? But then they announced in RIZIN that they're going to have Ryan Bader fight the winner of this heavyweight tournament. It's like, I don't think he even needs to train. He's just done this Oscar bait film with The Rock that's a frame-for-frame remake of a documentary that's much better called The Smashing Machine, where Mark Kerr is played by young Mark Kerr rather than 60-year-old The Rock in prosthetics, looking like that Tim Robinson skit. But yeah, Bader could train for this like Mark Coleman used to train for fights where he'd go, oh, commercial break, better do some burpees. But what was good on RIZIN? Main event, Razabali Shaidulev smoked Kleber Koika-Erbst, who's been one of the better featherweights outside the UFC for a long time. And this dude smoked him in one punch. 13-0, 13 finishes. He's good. And then Chihiro Suzuki versus Mikuru Asakura. Asakura took him down and humped him against the ropes in the corner for the whole 3 rounds. And I was watching it going, there are people who pretend that the ropes stop this. There are people who pretend that the ring prevents this from happening. Anything else good on there? There's a guy called Hagiwara who's got some interesting striking, scored a knockout. The really crazy thing is, this is how bad the state of Japanese kickboxing is. In terms of talent, they're better than they've ever been. In terms of having money to pay that talent, every top kickboxer is now trying MMA instead. There's a guy called Toki Tamaru, who I talk about occasionally on the podcast, top 10 pound for pound in the world as a kickboxer. He's doing MMA fight. He did his MMA debut on this RIZIN card and got held down. And he was tearfully doing his post-fight press conference being like, yeah, getting up's a lot harder than it looks. But meanwhile, Taiyo Asahisa gets to fight, he gets to kickbox on the same card against a random TV company employee. His nickname was Annoying But Strong in Japanese. And the guy literally just ran circles around the ring. I was like, is Toki Tamaru being made to do the Yakuza humiliation ritual by fighting MMA even though he can't? Or is Taiyo Asahisa doing the Yakuza humiliation ritual by fighting an actual clown? Very strange stuff. But well worth a watch, RIZIN. I mean, the production values for these events are insane. They got guys coming out who are legit bums, and they make them look like, you know, it's like watching Madonna in concert in her prime. The amount of pyro and lights and amazing, you know, it's the Tokyo Dome and they got a huge video thing going on behind them. Every pre-fight video package makes it look like the hypest showdown you've ever seen. Like the 2 guys are going to fight to the death, even though the fight turns out crap. And you're going, why is the UFC so bland? And the answer, of course, is always because they're cheap. But yeah, man, it's fun to watch something like this from time to time because they only do a couple a year, RIZIN, and it's always such a treat just to soak in all the stuff that isn't the fighting, and then some of the fights turn out good too. Anyway, I'm your boy Jack Slack. Sign up to the Patreon, watch the Film Room with Willie Pep, which is free on the YouTube, read the Willie Pep Advanced Striking 2.0, which is on the Patreon, and join me later in the week for the Boycast. Cheers! Are we allowed to section Ponzinibbio to prevent him from fighting again? Bless.